Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, February 12th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Netanyahu says the ceasefire in Gaza will end if the hostages are not released by Saturday. So he's essentially repeating what Trump said a day earlier. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a video statement Tuesday that if Hamas does not release Israeli hostages in Gaza by noon on Saturday, the Gaza ceasefire will end and Israel will restart its genocidal war. Netanyahu said, quote, "If Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire will end and the IDF will return to intense fighting until Hamas is finally defeated," end quote. This statement comes after President Trump's call for the ceasefire to be canceled if Hamas does not release the hostages by Saturday. Trump stressed that all remaining hostages should be released, while Netanyahu initially did not specify a number. So around the same time Netanyahu put this statement out, an Israeli official speaking to the Times of Israel said that Israel would resume bombing Gaza if 9 hostages are not released by Saturday. And that is not part of the deal. Under the deal, Hamas is supposed to release 3 hostages on Saturday. And the reason why they said the number 9 was because out of the 17 hostages that are remaining to be released under the first phase of the ceasefire deal, 9 are expected to actually be alive. The rest are believed to be dead. So we had that. But then there was another statement from another Israeli official speaking to Israeli media saying, no, actually, Israel is demanding that Hamas release all 76 hostages or else the ceasefire is over. So this is a really bad sign. And, again, Hamas is scheduled to release 3 hostages on Saturday. They said that they would postpone, that hostage release was postponed until Israel lives up to its end of the ceasefire. And Netanyahu and Israeli officials speaking to the media say that their demand was justified, claiming that Hamas's announcement itself was a ceasefire violation. But Israeli officials also admitted to the New York Times that Hamas's claims about Israel's truce violations were accurate. So I'll get more into that in another story. And so, this state of where we are right now, Hamas and made their announcement after Trump's repeated calls for the U.S. to take over Gaza, for the Palestinians to be expelled permanently. And he's continuing to say that. And we know from Israeli media reports that Netanyahu's trying to sabotage this ceasefire deal. And the people who are emboldened really by what Trump has been saying are Netanyahu and the other elements of the Israeli government who don't want the ceasefire to be fulfilled. So one thing I think that's worth mentioning is that I mentioned, there's this polling that there's strong support among Israelis for President Trump's plan for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. But there's also strong support, according to polling, relatively strong support, 60-something% want the ceasefire deal to be implemented because they want all the hostages to come home. So there is that element of this. And I know a lot of elements of the Israeli military, they're not too keen on restarting this thing because they failed. They failed to defeat Hamas. They just slaughtered a bunch of Palestinians, and Hamas clearly remains as a fighting force. But again, the people that they're emboldening are the, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who's saying he's going to quit the government if Israel doesn't restart after the first phase. So this is what he said on Tuesday amid these calls from Trump to cancel the ceasefire and Netanyahu now. So this is him on X. Smotrich said, quote, "Mr. Prime Minister, I call on you, following such a moral, simple, and clear statement by President Trump, to inform Hamas unequivocally either all the hostages are released by Saturday, The beatings are over, the games are over, or the gates of hell are opened on them. And that means no electricity, no water, no fuel, no humanitarian aid. There is only fire and brimstone from our planes and artillery and tanks and heroic fighters. There is a complete occupation of the Gaza Strip. There is an expulsion of all Gazans from the Strip in continuation of President Trump's plan. There is a taking of territory and the imposition of sovereignty over it, because this is the painful price that our enemy understands, end quote. So Smotrich saying, full siege, don't let any food in, starve them out, kill them, expel them if they don't want to leave, kill them. So that, he's calling for ethnic cleansing and genocide if the people don't leave. And this is what Ben-Gvir is saying as well, who he did quit the government over the ceasefire deal, but he's saying if Trump's plan is implemented, then he would rejoin. Ben-Gvir said that Trump is, quote, giving the government the green light to rain fire and hell on Gaza if all our hostages are not released, and the government prefers to continue down the reckless path, end quote. So just really not good, and just such a fragile ceasefire. You could argue that it's not a real ceasefire because Israel's been violating it, but what we could return to, the airstrikes and the siege, I mean, just with the situation in Gaza, with all the rubble, just absolutely would be horrific. And it would be supported by the U.S. with U.S. bombs, U.S. political support. All right, so the next one here, Hamas's claims on Israel's ceasefire violations are accurate. So this is a story on the fact that Israeli officials admitted to the New York Times that Hamas's claims about Israel violating the ceasefire are accurate. And this was buried in this New York Times story. I saw this because Jeremy Scahill tweeted about it. It was the 9th paragraph in this New York Times story about the situation with the ceasefire, that they revealed that Israeli officials have said, oh, yeah, well, actually, they're right. Hamas is right. Even though all the stories in kind of the U.S. Western media are making it seem like things are more complicated than that. And they also cited anonymous Israeli officials and officials from the mediating countries, which is either Qatar or Egypt. So, and specific things, really specifically, this seems to be about the Israel not letting nearly enough tents in or mobile homes. The Gaza's media office said that only 10% of the required tents have entered Gaza. Israel agreed as part of the ceasefire deal to let in hundreds of thousands of tents, but they've only let in a fraction of that. And they've also not let any mobile homes, you think of a trailer, they haven't let anything like that in. And I think that's probably intentional because they don't want any kind of reconstruction or livable situation for them. They want to keep the people in Gaza in these miserable, horrific conditions, so that, especially as Trump is saying, Trump's whole thing is, oh, they can't live there. Look at it. They absolutely can't live there. Well, the Palestinians are saying they want to be there for the most part. That's what the ones that I've seen interviewed all say. I've said this before. I'm sure that if some of them had the opportunity to leave, they would take it. But overall, they want to stay. It's their land, and they don't want to give it up. And if they try to go through with this Trump plan, they're going to have to, either kill them or force them off in some other way. So that's why, Israel's not letting the tents. They don't want them to restore any sort of better conditions for these people. Besides blocking the promised aid, Israeli forces have also continued to kill Palestinians in Gaza. The health ministry said on Tuesday that since the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th, Israeli forces have killed 92 Palestinians in Gaza and wounded 822. The director of the health ministry said that 24 Palestinians have died of previously sustained wounds as well, meaning that the total number of Palestinians that have died due to Israeli aggression is at least 118 since January 19th. And in that same period, 641 bodies have been recovered, which is nowhere near the 14,000 that they say are missing. So again, besides the aid situation, they've continued to kill Palestinians in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Jordan's Abdullah says that he opposes displacement of Palestinians. So after meeting with President Trump at the White House, Jordan's King Abdullah said that he reiterated Amman's opposition to the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. And so this is after he met with Trump and essentially after he went through a humiliation ritual in front of the press while sitting alongside President Trump. So this is what he wrote on Twitter after the meeting. He said, quote, "I reiterated Jordan's steadfast position against the displacement of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. That is the unified Arab position. Rebuilding Gaza without displacing the Palestinians and addressing the dire humanitarian situation should be the priority for all," end quote. So he's saying, reconstruction while keeping the Palestinians there. And again, this is really something here. This press conference that happened, they didn't do the full press conference at the end, but essentially before their meeting, they sat down in the Oval Office and took questions. And Abdullah was not looking good. I mean, he was doing this weird thing. He kept blinking like really kind of hard. It looked like kind of a tick. And I was looking back at videos of him to see if he had it. And the only one if he had it before, if he's kind of had this tick. The only other time that I found it, I could have missed, it could be something he's had for a while, but the only other time I saw something similar was when he was in visiting Biden last year, amid the U.S. backing this slaughter in Gaza. He visited Biden, and while Biden was giving his little address, he was like, blinking, he just like face twitching and everything. So it could be like a nervous thing. And I mean, I think, if people don't understand the dynamic here, a mass displacement of Palestinians into Jordan is an existential threat for Abdullah. About half the population of Jordan is Palestinian. And the big fear for Abdullah and for the Hashemites that have ruled Jordan is they fear a Palestinian uprising. And, even though he is a puppet of the U.S. to some extent, this is something, again, that's existential to him. This possibility of sending millions of Palestinians into Jordan. So there's a lot at stake here for him, but he did not express any real opposition to Trump's plan in this meeting. And Trump was sitting next to him and saying all this stuff about it was going to take over Gaza, how all the Palestinians are going to leave. And I mean, Anel Sheline at Responsible Statecraft, she wrote up a thing about this meeting. She was the one, she quit the Biden administration over Gaza. And she mentioned in that 94% of Jordanians are boycotting American goods. And Jordan is totally in bed. There's 14 U.S. military installations in Jordan. There's 4,000 U.S. troops. The U.S. gives Jordan about $1.5 billion a year in aid. And according to her article, that's about 10% of Jordan's budget. So he's very reliant on the U.S. At the same time, all of his people hate this relationship. They were very angry that Jordan helped intercept missiles fired from Iran to Israel. There's been attacks. There was an attack on the Israeli border by the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, which did very well in recent parliamentary elections. So this is, again, just an existential threat to him. And he had to sit there and take it. And when he was asked about his opposition to the plan, this is what he said, quote, "Mr. President, we have to keep in mind that there is a plan from Egypt and the Arab countries. We're being invited by Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to Riyadh, to discussions in Riyadh. I think the point is how to make this work in a way that is good for everybody," end quote. Essentially what he was saying is, we got to wait and see what the other Arab countries say. We're going to come up, they're coming up with something, and we'll see what we have to say about it. And then it wasn't until after the meeting that he said, "I reiterated my opposition to the displacement of the Palestinians." So after the meeting between Abdullah and Trump, Egypt announced that it would present a comprehensive proposal for the reconstruction of Gaza that would allow the Palestinians to stay in their land. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was scheduled to visit Washington on February 18th, but that has been delayed and postponed. And again, these are two countries that are, the U.S. gives them aid because they signed peace treaties with Israel. And, it goes to show this is just no minor thing. this threat to them that could result if they go through with Trump's plan. And just in general, the Arab leaders are all in the U.S.'s pocket essentially, but the people aren't. And the people really are not happy with what's happening, obviously, in Gaza and their leaders' relationships with the U.S. So it's just a dynamic to keep in mind. And I do have a soft spot for Abdullah because Jordan's the only country I've really visited in the region for any extended period of time, and it's great. Jordan is a beautiful country, and it's just an amazing place. So I really don't want that country to be destabilized. But we will see what happens with all this. So the next one here, the Houthis are ready to restart attacks on Israel if the Gaza ceasefire fails. So Yemen's Houthis are ready to restart attacks on Israel if there is an escalation of Israeli attacks on Gaza and the ceasefire falls apart, the group's leader said on Tuesday. This is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. He said, quote, "Our hands are on the trigger and we are ready to immediately escalate against the Israeli enemy if it returns to escalation in the Gaza Strip," end quote. So the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, had disrupted Red Sea shipping by targeting Israeli-linked ships in response to the onslaught in Gaza, and also began increasingly targeting Israeli territory with missiles and drones, and some got through Israel's air defenses. President Biden launched a bombing campaign against the Houthis in January 2024, which lasted a year and only escalated the situation as the Houthis expanded their attacks on shipping in response. All along, the Houthis said they would stop their attacks if there was a ceasefire in Gaza, and they were true to their word once the truce was reached in January. So the Houthi attacks have stopped, and they're saying they're going to restart. And this is a thing. The region could explode again if Israel escalates again in Gaza. And this is one way the Houthis could start attacking Israel, hitting shipping again. Is the Trump administration going to start bombing Yemen again? Is that going to be their response? And then the Iraqi Shia militias, there's reports saying that they could start attacking Israel again. And there's always a chance that they could start attacking U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria again. And that's what led to 3 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers being killed at that secretive base in Tower 22 in Jordan. So it's just not good. There's just so many other effects that this will have if Israel starts really bombing Gaza again. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky says no security guarantees without the U.S. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said European countries could not guarantee Ukraine's security without the U.S. in an apparent response to Trump administration officials saying that Europe should take the lead on the conflict. Zelensky said in an interview with The Guardian published on Tuesday, quote, "There are voices which say that Europe could offer security guarantees without the Americans, and I always say no. Security guarantees without America are not real security guarantees," end quote. So U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said in a recent interview that the Europeans have to own the conflict in Ukraine going forward. And during the transition period, there are these reports saying that Trump suggested European troops being deployed to Ukraine to enforce the ceasefire. Zelensky's response to that was, we need about 200,000 of them, but there also has to be Americans involved. That's what Zelensky said. And his demands for security guarantees are just nothing remotely acceptable for Russia, which has all the leverage right now. And so, that's not a good sign for peace. Zelensky is meeting with J.D. Vance this week at the Munich Security Conference. And Vance, so that'll be interesting. Vance, when he was a senator, for the short time he was a senator, he was a very strong opponent to the proxy war in Ukraine. It was kind of one of his things. So it'll be interesting to see how that meeting goes. All right, so the next one here, Trump says that Ukraine may be Russian someday. So President Trump said in an interview that aired on Monday that Ukraine may be Russian someday when pushing his idea for a rare earth mineral deal in exchange for U.S. support. He said, quote, "Ukraine has tremendously valuable land in terms of rare earth, in terms of oil and gas, in terms of other things. I want to have our money secured because we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars and, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal, they may be Russian someday, or they may not be Russian someday," end quote. The president said that he told the Ukrainians that he wants the equivalent of about $500 billion in rare earth minerals, And he said that Ukraine had essentially agreed to the idea. Zelensky has made clear that he's open to this rare earth mineral deal. And Trump is sending his Treasury Secretary to Ukraine now, and this is apparently what they're going to discuss. So this is something, because the implication here, even what Trump says, he said, I told them we've got to do something. We got to get something out of this. He's saying we can't continue to pay this money without getting something. So, it's, again, saying that it's implying that it's going to continue. All right, so the next one here, American freed from Russia after Trump's envoy's trip to Moscow. So this one's from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So here's some diplomacy that happened with Russia. Mark Fogel, an American teacher arrested in Russia for possession of marijuana, was released from jail after Donald Trump's envoy traveled to Moscow. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's trip to Russia is the first by an American official since the invasion of Ukraine. Fogel was released from Russian prison on Tuesday, according to the White House. Mike Waltz said, quote, today, President Donald J. Trump and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, are able to announce that Mr. Witkoff is leaving Russian airspace with Mark Fogel, an American who is detained by Russia. President Trump, Steve Witkoff, and the president's advisors negotiated an exchange that serves as a show of good faith from the Russians and a sign we are moving in the right direction to end the brutal and terrible war in Ukraine, end quote. So Fogel worked at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow before he was arrested in 2021 for the possession of marijuana. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison and served 3. So again, this is a good sign here for potential diplomacy with Russia. At least they're talking and they're doing some things. All right, so the next one here, Syria plants landmines along the Lebanon border. This one's from Jason Ditz. Though cross-border gunfire between Syria and Lebanon seems to have paused for now, the tensions are still rising, with a number of Syrian Shiites having fled into Lebanese border towns, and Syrian army soldiers loyal to the Islamist government raiding Shiite towns and villages across the area. The Syrian government, this is the HTS-led government, is now announcing that having swept the border areas with Lebanon, they are in the process of planting landmines at every road and crossing that heads into their neighboring country. They termed these illegal border crossings. In practice, the border is historically not strictly enforced between Syria and Lebanon everywhere. And in some towns like Hawik, just plain span, there are towns that are on both sides of the border. It's a very, you think about when the borders were drawn of Syria and Lebanon by the Europeans, what about all the people that lived in those border regions? And this is one of those areas. So it's a very, it's an area where people go back and forth a lot, and now they're planting all these mines and everything. So not a good sign. It means some more fighting is likely going to happen in this area. All right, so the next one here, Israel establishes 9 permanent occupation bases in South Syria. So this one is from the Cradle, and this is just an expansion of the Israeli occupation of southern Syria. So Israeli occupation forces have discreetly established a security zone within Syrian territory with 9 sites already under advanced construction within the occupied buffer zone beyond it and on Mount Hermon. Israeli Army radio reported on February 10th. The Army has established 9 bases extending from Mount Hermon and through Quneitra until Dera Governorate, which appeared to be permanent. And this is according to the report from Israeli media, that these bases appear to be permanent. There is currently no set timeline for how long Israel will maintain control over this security zone, but the Army has confirmed that it will remain until it is certain that there are no threats to Israel. The Army has also established security cooperation with Jordan for mutual issues against factions in South Syria and possible Hamas cells. 3 Army brigades currently operate on Syrian territory, an increase from the 1.5 battalions stationed in the occupied Golan Heights before October 7th, 2023. So just more Israel solidifying this occupation in southern Syria. All right, so the next one here, Iran's president says the U.S. is not sincere about talks. So I actually wrote this one up yesterday, but I forgot to put it in the show yesterday. So this is Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian. He said on Monday that the U.S. was not sincere about negotiations with Iran, citing new sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. President Trump has reimposed his so-called maximum pressure campaign on Iran and added new sanctions while claiming that he was not happy about it and saying that he wanted a deal with Tehran. So Pezeshkian said, quote, "If the U.S. were sincere about negotiations, why did they sanction us?" End quote. And I think this is a sign, we saw the Ayatollah. One thing that I think that it's more important what he said, because he's the final word. When Pezeshkian came in, he ran a campaign on negotiating with the West, dealing with them directly to get sanctions relief. After he was sworn in, the Ayatollah Khamenei basically gave him the green light. If you can talk to them. No hurt. And he basically said there's no harm in speaking with the enemy. But now, after the maximum pressure, we've seen Khamenei say, nah, it's foolish. There's no point in talking to the U.S. And now Pezeshkian is saying they're not serious about diplomacy. So it's just not a good sign. But hopefully something's going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of. A lot of times with the U.S. and Iran, there is, like in Oman, there's some kind of channels for talks. So hopefully something like that's happening behind the scenes. Trump is showing that he's not interested in bombing Iran or anything like that. So I think at least that is good. You can't have very high expectations, I guess. But the last story here, the day Israel came for the Booksellers. So this article is from 972 magazine. So Israeli authorities, Israeli police in eastern Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, they arrested the owner of a bookstore and his nephew, and they seized a selection of books, including a children's coloring book. And they said that these books met the criteria for incitement. So they arrested the booksellers for incitement. And this is a bookstore. Apparently, these books were mostly not in Arabic, because they cater to a lot of tourists in occupied East Jerusalem. And the children's coloring book was called "From the River to the Sea," which is a slogan that the Israelis don't like, but it's literally a children's coloring book that they used as evidence for this. And so it's just kind of another step in Israel's just blatant disregard for the Palestinians, any sort of freedom in these occupied territories. But this is kind of just a story about it, interviewing some of the people and everything involved. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Michael Clare, a new military-industrial complex arises. One from Dan Steinbach, Trump's sphere of influence tariffs. One from Caitlin Johnstone, the Gaza ceasefire is being sabotaged by Israel, by Trump, and by the media. One from Ted Snyder, Indonesia in BRICS is a huge deal that went unnoticed. And that is true. Indonesia has a huge population, and it's, a big emerging market. And, it's been a big question of, will they lean more toward the U.S. or China? And it seems like they're going more in China's direction. The spotlight from Branko March-Teach, Trump risks repeating Biden's disasters in Gaza. So please go check all of that out. Check out our blog. We have Ron Paul's great show, The Liberty Report, over there. Kyle Anzalone's great show, Conflicts of Interest. Lots of stuff in the lower part of the page. That is it for me for today. You could always support this show by liking and subscribing, sharing it with your friends. Tell everybody about antiwar.com. Follow us on social media, on Instagram, on TikTok, on X. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.